Hello, everybody. Welcome to week 13 of the course. 2 weeks to go. So we're 2.5 weeks, really. We're getting close. One quick announcement in the beginning. Next week is Thanksgiving, so hopefully everybody's looking forward to that. So we are going to have the reading, and I'm going to do a video for next week. But because it's the holiday, I've decided not to post a discussion question for next week. So there'll be no discussion question for next week. So you guys won't have to worry about that. So you can hopefully enjoy the holiday with your families, or Black Friday, or whatever whatever you want to do. Okay. So this week last week we were looking at some possible solutions to the idea of gridlock in the government. Even though last week we discussed that gridlock may not necessarily be a bad thing, right? I mean, we still want to be able to get things done, right? So a couple of solutions we looked at to gridlock this past week. The first was this article by Alexis Semendinger called "The Power of One." Right, so this is the idea of presidential power. Right, so if Congress can't agree on anything, the president's got to step in and do something. Right, and of course this is very timely because with the new Congress coming in, President Obama is afraid that once that happens, he won't be able to get anything passed. So now there's this big debate about immigration reform and him issuing an executive order regarding immigration, and of course this is sparking off all sorts of tensions in Congress. But of course, in order to invalidate the executive order, there'd have to be a 2/3 majority in the Senate, and it looks like there won't be a 2/3 majority in the Senate to overturn the executive order. Anyway, it's a timely issue. So before we talk about that, though, we should just sort of do a brief refresher on presidential power. And the problem that arises with presidential power, I think we've discussed this briefly in the past, is that it's left pretty vague in the Constitution, right? And the reason for that was a lot of the framers of the Constitution were afraid of executive power, just coming out of, the tyranny of Great Britain. They didn't want to find themselves in the same position. But Hamilton said, look, we need this executive power, especially in times of crisis. And that, is often the times when presidents do exercise their authority more. So that kind of worked the way that, at least that Hamilton wanted it to. But the question is, the interesting thing about political power is that once you gain it, typically you don't give it back, right? So the president gains these extra powers during times of crisis, but when we go back to peacetime or more stable times, the president still retains that precedent of power that they had. So yes, I mean the president had some powers laid out, right? So he has the power to veto, the power to appoint, the power to pardon, commander-in-chief, can convene Congress in extraordinary circumstances, can make treaties, and I think that's it, right? So those are the only explicit powers given to the president. But the president is also charged with executing or making happen the laws that are passed by Congress, faithfully executing the laws passed by Congress. So under that sort of mandate, the president has derived a lot of these sort of executive orders. And the way that typically works is, so in order to execute all these particular laws that are passed by Congress, the president creates different departments, different agencies, right? Or at least suggests they be created, and then Congress will confirm them. But, the first three were with Washington when he had Treasury, War, and Foreign Affairs. Now those became still the Treasury Department. War became the Department of Defense because that sounds a little more politically correct. And Foreign Affairs became the Department of State. Right? So those were the first three agencies that were created to help the president execute any laws that were made in that particular division. However, things have gotten a little more complicated since then, and currently there are around 2,000 federal agencies, executive agencies that have been created to help the president enforce the laws that are created by Congress. So the president, what the president can do, it says in the Constitution that he can require reports from these people, the heads of these particular agencies. So essentially, it says that the heads of the agencies report to the president. So what happens is the president issues an executive order, and that applies to the workers that fall under the executive branch, right? But so it affects the internal policies of the executive branch in the government, but oftentimes, those cases affect people external to the federal government. For instance, the president is in charge of the Department of Homeland Security. It's in his cabinet, right? And it just so happens that Customs and Immigration falls under the Department of Homeland Security. So if the president issues an executive order about immigration, the Department of Homeland Security and Immigration and Customs are legally bound. It's an executive order carries the weight of law, so they're legally bound to follow that. And he says that these illegal immigrants are not to be deported. Legally speaking, the employees of Immigration and Customs cannot deport those particular citizens, right? Now there are recourses to executive orders. One, Congress can pass a law, right, that declares what the president has done to be null, and he needs to undo it. Also, the Supreme Court can rule an executive order unconstitutional. So there are recourses in place, but once again, this gives a tremendous amount of authority to the president, right? Simmendinger talked about in her article how President Bush, used an executive order to cut funding for embryonic stem cell research because a lot of that funding was federally funded and fell under his purview. So he restricted the funding money there, and this notion of tightening the grasp on presidential documents, right? It used to be the case that they were all public records, but President Bush issued an executive order saying that the president has the right to maintain secrecy for certain amount of their documents, strategies, communications, things like that. So several executive orders, right? President Obama also issued several executive orders. He ordered that Guantanamo Bay be closed, right? He ordered that Iraq and Afghanistan come to an end by a certain amount of time. So presidents, they do this all the time. They issue these executive orders. One area of presidential power that's particularly tricky is war, right? Because the president is the commander-in-chief, right? So that's one of the explicit powers listed in the Constitution. And under that, he has the legitimate authority to wage wars. However, declaring war is reserved for Congress. So even though the president has the authority to wage war, he does not have the authority to declare war. However, the last time that war was officially declared in the United States was after the bombing of Pearl Harbor in 1941. But since then, we've been in Korea, we've been in Vietnam, we've been in Iraq, we've been in the Balkans, we've been in Iraq again, we've been in Afghanistan, and several other places, right? So lots of those things would be considered wars, and they're often called wars, even though they're not technically wars because it was never declared by Congress. So the question becomes, how much authority should the president have when it comes to waging war? Now, after Vietnam, this was obviously really questioned because Johnson was withholding a lot of information from Congress regarding what was going on in Vietnam. So they passed something called Congress passed the War Powers Act in 1973 that said the president can deploy military force, but after 60 days, so he can deploy military force, but he must notify Congress within 48 hours officially, and after 60 days, Congress must approve the military action, which did happen in Iraq and Afghanistan. Congress passed a joint resolution authorizing military force against Iraq. So yeah, anyway, this idea of executive orders seems to be one way to potentially sidestep, this idea of gridlock, right? But the question becomes, is it a good solution? Are we going to run into the same issues that are faced under a monarchy, giving too much power to one individual? And wasn't that the entire point of checks and balances and separation of power? right? So maybe in times of crisis, as it was originally designated, it makes sense. But even at that though, right? How do you define a time of crisis? And it can be manipulated, towards a particular agenda, as some people argue happened in Iraq. So anyway, that's one particular possible solution to gridlock, right? Whether it's a good solution or not is up for debate. But even with that, right, we have to remember too that there are checks and balances in place, even with executive orders. However, the legislative check is quite slim, right? Because the two-thirds majority in both the Senate and the House of Representatives are going to have to override the president's executive order, which means that all the president has to do is get 34 votes in the Senate. And it's very unlikely that the president cannot get 34 votes in the Senate, right? So hard to override legislatively. However, the Supreme Court, can strike it down. So there are possibilities for overriding executive orders. And what often happens is that the president orders an executive order, president goes out of office, new president comes in, overturns the executive order. That's the more commonplace thing. Okay, so the second possible solution to gridlock is this notion of political parties, right? So the Constitution, the framers were very careful in separating power, making sure that individual rights, individual liberties were protected. The Anti-Federalists went a long way to doing that with the Bill of Rights. So it's great that we're protecting individual liberty, but this sort of, wide representation, as we see, can make it difficult to get things done, right? So one solution that has evolved over time in the American government to getting things done, in spite of this division of powers, is our political parties. So in the beginning, there were no political parties, right? George Washington was not a member of a political party, and even in his farewell speech, he warned, against the dangers of political parties. And even Madison, when he was talking about factions and how dangerous factions are to a democratic form of government, warned against this. But ironically, Madison and Jefferson actually formed a party in opposition to. So after Washington left office, John Adams ran on the Federalist campaign, Federalist platform. So the first American political party was the Federalist Party, which was, as you would assume, strong national government. John Adams, Alexander Hamilton, major players in the Federalist Party. But after that, after the one term of the Federalist Party, the Democratic Republican Party was born. And that was comprised of James Madison and Thomas Jefferson were the big ones, sort of going back to the anti-Federalist side, which is ironic considering Madison was he was author of the Federalist Papers, but yet he sort of supported this anti-Federalist party because he was afraid that Hamilton had gone too far, in some of the economic and financial policies that he had put into place. So he worked with his friend Thomas Jefferson to run for election under the Democratic Republican Party, and they won. They won in the third election. Jefferson became the third president, or technically speaking, I guess the second election, because Washington wasn't really ever up for debate whether Washington would be president or not. But anyway, so you had the Democratic Republican Party, and they were dominant. That was the end of the Federalist Party after that point. But they did start to split, right? So the Democratic Party technically formed first under Andrew Jackson. He was, the first strong Democratic president was Andrew Jackson. And then the Republican Party arose at the beginning of the Civil War. Abraham Lincoln was the first Republican president. And it was sort of formed on, as you would assume, an anti-slavery platform. And the Whig Party was in there as well, but we don't need to get too far into the weeds on the history of political parties in America. But so after the Civil War, we'll go a little bit farther into the weeds. After the Civil War was what became known as sort of the golden age of political parties, sort of the end of the 1800s, into the 19th century. And this is where we get this notion of like a political machine, right? And this was sort of like a perfect storm for political parties, because also during that time, immigration was at an all-time high in America. There were several immigrants coming over, Irish immigrants, Italian immigrants coming over from Europe. And these political parties and these political machines were using sort of the parties to try to influence these immigrants to join the party, to give more power to the party. So during that time, they were offering all sorts of services. They were doing picnics, they were doing parades, they were offering medical care. This was before the federal government provided any of these services. So the parties themselves were actually providing a lot of these services, but they weren't doing it for the welfare of the people. They were doing it in exchange for votes, right? In exchange for making their party strong. So we often think of the heyday, of political parties being strong and people being unified around political parties. That kind of goes back to this sort of late 1800s movement, this golden age, and they stayed strong for quite a while until sort of FDR and the Great Depression. And during the Great Depression, FDR, of course, crafted the New Deal legislation, and a lot of the benefits that were being provided by the parties were provided by government. Government took over. That's when sort of the huge government apparatus sort of arose, was during the New Deal. So without having sort of that benefit of offering those services, party allegiances started to weaken. Right. Another important thing to remember about political parties is that we often think of political parties being tied to a specific agenda, and they are temporarily, right? But political parties use interests and certain agendas to get elected. Whatever agenda they think is going to get them elected, those are the interests that they're going to pursue, right? It's not like they have this strong ideological base, because if you sort of track the history of political parties through time, you'll see that the Democratic Party and what they stood for sort of in the early 20th century is very different than what they stand for now. And same thing for the Republican Party. Their views evolve along the times, along with the views of the citizens, right? So yeah, the parties have weakened, and we may make the argument. There are a couple of arguments. One is that the parties are weaker than ever because we saw the study of the millennial generation and Generation X, that people are not identifying themselves with the Democratic and Republican parties anymore. On the other side, we could argue that political parties are stronger than ever, right? Because of the donations that are coming in from the wealthy donors and the wealthy businesses to try to put forward their agenda. So it's interesting that even though the parties are gaining a lot of strength via money, they're not actually appealing to the voters as much, right? Or at least to the younger generation of voters who are largely identifying themselves as independents now. So it's an interesting sort of situation now. But oftentimes, at least currently, we tend to think of political parties as bad things, right? We tend to think of them as polarizing. You got the two sides, and it's impossible, right? And it is impossible for one side to represent everybody's view on every single platform issue that party claims to stand for, right? Our views are more nuanced than that. However, the benefit to that is, imagine if there were no political parties, and imagine if it were a free-for-all, where everybody sort of put forward, take these 10 policy positions, and everybody's got different permutations of what policies they support and which they don't. Imagine how difficult it would be to get things passed then, right? So they mobilize political parties, for better or worse, mobilize support in favor of a particular agenda, right? And they do that because the way the government is set up, you have to assemble a majority, and in some cases you have to assemble a two-thirds majority to actually get legislation passed. So parties have formed as a sort of like a shortcut to allow us to overcome gridlock in a lot of ways, even though we tend to think of parties as causing gridlock. In fact, parties actually fight against gridlock, right? Another thing that parties do is that they encourage civic participation, right? And we think of civic participation being at an all-time low, especially as far as voting goes. But imagine what civic participation would look like if there were no parties, right? If we were just everybody up to their own individual whims. Once again, the parties provide a vehicle for people to participate. And perhaps the most important thing that they do in a democratic society is that they provide sort of the vehicle for debate, right, around the big issues that support us, that confront us in America. Whether it's gun rights or abortion, they provide a platform for us to have this national debate over these important issues. Without them pushing this particular agenda forward, um, who knows where the debate would be. So even though we get fed up with the parties, maybe it's time for the parties to change, or maybe at least it's time for the parties to change, their viewpoints on particular things. I still believe that parties provide, an important force for progress and overcoming gridlock in American politics. So I'm certainly not saying that you should hold the party lines on everything. I think you should question certain things. But it's a powerful mechanism that's available to us as American citizens. So, okay, so this week we're looking at the fourth branch, right? I bet you guys didn't know there were 4 branches to the U.S. government. Well, while not officially there are 4 branches, however, there in practically speaking there are 4 branches, and the fourth branch is called the federal bureaucracy, which is these 2,000 agencies that I was talking about earlier that fall under sort of the executive authority and carry out, the laws, make sure that the laws actually get put into place. Things like the Department of State, the Department of Defense, the Environmental Protection Agency, the Department of Education, things like that. So that's what we're talking about. We're talking about the fourth branch. You guys are going to have a couple of articles to look at this week to see why, in fact, people are, and it's kind of a scary trend, that people are shying away from public service, right? This current, the younger generation, which is particularly disturbing considering that a lot of the people who comprise the management and the leadership of the federal bureaucracy are getting near the retirement age. So anyway, I hope you guys enjoy those articles. Next week, in addition to those articles, I'll talk more about the structure of the federal bureaucracy and what it looks like. Hope you have a great week. I will post the discussion question on Wednesday morning. And remember, no discussion next week. Have a great week.